Welcome to Art and Objects August 15, Important Paintings, Photographs and Contemporary Art Catalogue, currently on view at 3 Abbey Street here in Newton. This is a really interesting catalogue, very strong photography section. Ben's going to talk about some of the really interesting and very rare photographs in just a minute. The catalogue has two very interesting collections, the Stella Group collection, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, and the collection of legendary Australian collector Peter Fay. All of the works in the catalogue are currently on view at Art and Object in 3 Abbey Street in Newton, and the auction is this coming Thursday at 6:30. For those of you that are watching and can't make it to the auction this coming Thursday, the auction will be streamed live on www.liveauctioneers.com, and you can view and bid online and view the auction live as it takes place.
One of the really nice things about this catalogue is the provenance and the history. We're really privileged to be offering some works with some wonderful history. I want to talk a little bit about those today. It's a larger sale for us. I think there's 165 odd lots, and that presents us with certain logistical difficulties in terms of installation. And I'm standing in front of a wall which is completely dedicated to works from the Peter Fay collection. It's a lovely wall to work with, this one with the little objects. I really enjoy it, and I think taken as a whole, I mean, it represents probably around 85–90% of Peter Fay's collection in the auction. It shows just what an interesting and diverse and a collector, but also what a very prescient eye he possessed. Peter Fay doesn't really need any introduction to Australian viewers, to an Australian audience. I mean, he really is a legend over there. He formed major, long-standing early relationships with artists like Rosalie Gascoigne, Schoon more recently. He supported them at times when their work was practically unsaleable. His collection has toured all over Australia and New Zealand, and he's famous for having, long-standing relationships and being massively respected. He's not so well known in New Zealand, but he's a passionate advocate and a great supporter of New Zealand art. He's very attracted to emerging artists, outsider artists, and I like to think that it's that aspect which led him to New Zealand art. I mean, I think a lot of New Zealand art is slightly less commercial than Australian art, and I think that's what attracted Peter Fay to it. He was particularly attracted to New Zealand photography. He first encountered New Zealand photographs in the collection of Les and Millie Paris on a visit to New Zealand, touring around with Jeff Thompson in that wonderful corrugated iron vehicle of his. And he was impacted by it immediately and set about straight away to start collecting New Zealand photography. He's got one of the most impressive private collections I've ever come across of Lawrence Eberhardt's photography, and just in front of me is this wonderful suite of 5 photos from his domestic architecture series, and they are just the most exquisite prints you would come across. Also a long-time advocate and supporter of Bill Colbert, and the work on your cover is perhaps the most striking example of his within the Peter Fay collection, but also wonderful early oil by Geoffrey Harris, and these two fantastic revisionist paintings by Tony Delatour, which are surely one of the more interesting bodies of work produced in this country in the last 20 years. So come along and do check out the Peter Fay collection. It's a wonderful example of how you can put together a great collection without being a multi-millionaire. Included in this catalogue and underpinned by the Peter Fay collection is our annual collection of New Zealand photography. And I'm standing before 4 photographs, 3 by New Zealanders, all which I feel are absolutely classic images, and which will over time establish themselves as among the more iconic New Zealand photographs produced in the last 10 years or so. We've got Yvonne Todd's Bow Dream up here, Jae-Hoon Lee's Farm, and one of Anne Noble's classic images from her Ruby's Room series. And taken as a whole, they show this wonderful new direction where New Zealand photography is heading. Jae-Hoon Lee's a prime example. This is his classic image of a New Zealand landscape entitled Farm. And what's really interesting about Jae-Hoon Lee, I think, he's an exemplar of the way the photographic image is changing. Earlier we might talk about, in the images of John Johns or Lawrence Eberhardt from the Fay collection, we talk about that ability to take that classic image. Here we're really talking about the ability to make that classic image. So there's no skill in this image involved in Jae-Hoon Lee putting himself in the right place and the right time and capturing the decisive moment. Rather, he's taken this photograph and then in Photoshop he's constructed it and made it over a period of time into a wonderful image. So really shows how the photographic image is changing.
I'm standing here in front of the installation, the exhibition of the 20 works of the Stella Group, a collective of 15 women in central Auckland who have been collecting contemporary New Zealand art in the period 2003 to 2013. It's a really interesting collection, and unlike many buying groups, it's got a number of works of genuine scale. They are a very enthusiastic group, and they have put together a collection that is really a reflection of contemporary practice in New Zealand from about 2000, and is really, I think, a window into a great way of collecting. We have offered a number of buying groups in the last 5 years. The Stella Group, I think, is really notable for, as I mentioned, works of scale, and very strong on photography with works by Fiona Partington and Mark Adams, and of course this magnificent Michael Paraco-Fay. I think one of the really interesting things about the Stella Group collection is that it reflects the diversity of media that artists have employed in the last 10 to 15 years. And here in just this corner here, this intersection of works by Michael Paraco-Fay, Ruben Patterson, Carl Morn and Judy Miller, we see a diversity of practice of painting on canvas, photography, Ruben Patterson's distinctive mixed media glitter works arranged there, and Judy Miller's unique take on abstract painting. And I think this is a particularly fine example of Miller's work, because you can see in the simple application of paint that bright red, that brilliant orange red substrate, and then the scraping and the moving of the paint over the canvas, the sense of chance coming into play, the lovely fluid gestural movement of the paint on the surface, all coalescing into this very satisfying and harmonious abstract painting. Really, really a great example of Miller's unique take on abstract painting in the 21st century.
Following on from the wonderful history and provenance that's in this catalogue is this beautiful McCaon charcoal drawing from his classic Cowrie subject. It's dated December 1953, and Peter Simpson was in the other day. I was talking to him about it. He mentioned that he feels it is among the first works that McCaon produced after moving from Christchurch to Auckland to take up his position at the Auckland Art Gallery. Now, I think he initially made that move about July, August, but according to his biographer, he didn't produce any work for that first 2 or 3 months in Auckland while he came to grips with the change in the environs and the landscape, and also in the climate. But December 1953, this one is dated, and it is just a beautiful study with the most limited means, just charcoal and paper. But it takes that cubist influence, which McCaon was infatuated with at the time, and marries it to the stunning local subject of West Auckland and the resplendent kauri trees which surrounded McCaon's property. And you can see just the way McCaon has captured the light and the form pouring through the West Auckland bush and piercing and cutting through the kauri in just a stunning fashion. So just a great example of how the greatest artists can, even with the most limited means, create something truly spectacular.
Theo Schoon is one of the most interesting artists in the mid-20th century in New Zealand art history, and is really a seminal figure for the intersection of Indigenous form making and high modernism. In this particular work, a very, very important work from the early 1960s, done up in pins and curlers, we see Schoon at his puckish best, I think. There's a wonderful sense of humour in this work. We think, of course, of Michael Illingworth's piss-quick works of the 1960s, lampooning conservative middle-class tastes in New Zealand society of the period. And this is Schoon, in his own way, doing something similar. But I think what we have here with this work is a really interesting pushing of painting technique with the splattering, the Pollock-esque, I guess we can call it, splattering of paint, and the abstracted patches of colour, and these really interesting, almost sort of electrical wiring, open-ended graphic elements. It posits perhaps as a head or a light bulb. There's been much speculation of the figurative nature of this work, but at the end of the day, it really reveals Schoon's really deep connections with modernist image making at its purest, and in that capacity, Schoon is a very important figure in New Zealand art history. This large format oil painting by Geoffrey Harris occupies both a unique position in his career and I think quite an important position within the conversation about New Zealand culture, and particularly the role of the expat. What I want to talk about first is the unique nature of this work within Harris's output. This work from 1973 is one of very, very few. In fact, doing the research on this work, I really couldn't find another work that sits as far outside Harris's traditional subject matter as this work does. Harris typically, in works of this period, depicted himself in the form of numerous self-portraits, his intense family relationships, and religious subject matter, crucifixions, depositions. Like McCaon, Harris placed these scenes within a New Zealand landscape context. This work, however, depicts the New Zealand authoress Catherine Mansfield in her garden in Menton in the south of France. And it speaks to the role of the expat, in some ways, if you like, the dislocated, the self-exiled expat, engaging with both the world, but trying to identify a sense of New Zealand identity and unique culture. That was very much an important conversation in this period. And so I think, when we look at this work, we also think of artists such as Rona Hazard, Frances Hodgkins, the pioneering role of female artists and writers in New Zealand culture in the 1920s and 30s. And this work is very much an homage to the courage of the expat to go into the world and forge both their own artistic identity and begin laying down, if you like, the train tracks of a distinctive New Zealand culture that we enjoy today.